How did America go from a nation that made it through the Great Depression to a nation that's now moving into the greatest depression in worse shape than it's ever been before?
We have a collapse around us, an economic collapse, a global economic collapse.
It's a class war of corporations to shift the burden onto people, and of the richest citizens to shift it on to everybody else.
We have undergone a coup d'etat in slow motion, and they've won and we've lost. We live in a corporate state. There's no piece of legislation by either party that seeks to redress the injustices, the grievances, and the legitimate suffering of the American people.
Other rich democracies that have capitalist economies that are as, and in many cases, more integrated in the global economy than we are, yet have nothing that looks like the rates of poverty we see in the United States.
We have been rendered utterly impotent as citizens. We have no formal mechanisms by which to ameliorate the deprivation, the dislocation, the disenfranchisement that has been visited on working men and women in this country.
You can't stop the crashes on Wall Street until you stop the skewed income distribution.
The consequences throughout the country are devastating. The numbers of people foreclosed, 1 in 4 children needing food stamps to eat, and there's no hope in sight.
The big lie that was sold to the American people, and one sucker bought it after another. You could make it on your own. But they don't tell you the other part of it. The reason you go to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale is to be a member of the club. They're not doing it on their own. They're not making the hundreds of millions of dollars because they're such geniuses. It's an inside club with inside deals.
When you create an oligarchic state and you become tone deaf to the pain that is visited on masses of people who, through no fault of their own, it's not their fault that the manufacturing jobs got up and left for Mexico and now are packing up and leaving for China. That is the responsibility of a state that betrayed its citizens.
Break the workforce, break unions, break the aspirations that workers have for a measure of dignity and the ability to sustain their families.
All of the protections that prevented a predatory corporate and oligarchic class from preying on weaker segments of society, all the constraints were lifted, and the assault began.
Wall Street has very intentionally and creatively created a system that absolutely guarantees that most people will not be able to find a job adequate to put food on the table.
We've had an overthrow in this country, but it happened from Wall Street.
They're bankrupting the country.
Lending each other money which didn't exist, paying each other bonuses from profits which weren't real.
They're looting the U.S. Treasury by printing trillions of dollars in greenbacks.
The free market means you don't go to jail when you pull a ripoff. That's part of the marketplace.
It's almost another world. Some writer called it Richistan. I mean, these corporate overlords make $900,000 an hour.
The goal is the third worldization of America.
We've gone from first world to third world in a blink of an eye.
The whole world, in fact, has been stolen by robber barons.
Speculation today is what is ruining the global economy. There are literally people starving.
It is no longer profitable to save lives. It's more profitable to kill people and destroy things, and that's exactly what's happening. So now when you see the Dow going to 10,000, 10,400, that's not because more people are working and happier, it's because more people are being killed.
The super rich have taken extensive measures to keep people in poverty. They've opposed every kind of democratic policy or legislation that people have tried to pass in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries.
We need to understand with Thomas Jefferson that the sole and orthodox purpose of government, as he put it, was ensuring the happiness of its people, not the wealth of its corporations, not the growth of its domestic product, but the happiness of its people.
The immorality of the American moral economy is not a moral issue. Of course it should be a moral issue. It is the moral issue of our time.
number of homeless in this country is growing exponentially. The number of unemployed is off the charts. And all the books are absolutely cooked in this country as to the number of unemployed because they stop counting them after their benefits run out. They stop counting the underemployed and those who have given up.
The aggregate number of people working is not really as significant as wages. Wages themselves are declining, and that's why people are going further into debt. Wages are not in any way commensurate with a middle-class lifestyle. Wages are disaster.
The United States government measures poverty in a very medieval way. They take the cost of a market basket of absolutely essential foods and multiply it by 3. That's what they call official poverty. Official poverty is 50 million. There is a measure called extreme poverty, those families that are living below $10,000 a year. And there are 17 million people who are living in these dire straits.
There are structural reasons why the poor are poor. It's not because they're not right with Jesus. Everybody tells us that, you know, it's always morning in America. Once we get through this recession, jobs are going to come back. And it's not true.
Poverty is concentrated in places that tend to exist outside media hubs. Exurbs, suburbs, rural America. Nobody has paid enough attention. And I think as long as that invisibility remains, as long as there really isn't this consciousness of how pervasive the poverty and the hunger and the destitution and the desperation is becoming, it's a tragedy, because these are the stories that are redefining what America is at the moment.
The very assault that we carried out on the working class is being carried out on the middle class. Areas that were seen as relatively stable and safe, and that is the suburban community itself. These post-industrial pockets are leaching outwards across the country.
Resource bases now, for most people or many people, are less predictable than they were before. People typically knew where they were going to sleep, they had food for this, etc. So everything is becoming more unpredictable. That's moving more people down the ladder. If they were situationally poor, they tend to be edging toward generationally poor. If they were middle class and they've lost their jobs, then they're moving more toward situational poverty.
Maybe we need a new class below the poor called les misérables. Those are the ones who are hopeless, who wouldn't even fall into what we used to call the poor category, who had a shelter and fresh water every day.
There's a desperation in America around this. There's a growth now of crime. There's the U.S. military sending units into America in the anticipation that there may be uprisings here. And, so far this has been talked of in terms of terrorism, but I think it's not just terrorism. In Japan, we have senior citizens becoming pickpockets and being arrested, old ladies, because they can't live on the income that they have.
Even before the current economic crisis, if you go back 5, 6, 7 years, increasingly you'd see that there was a growing group of people at the bottom of the economy who for various reasons were no longer able to make ends meet. And they were falling into poverty not because we had, as a society, become an impoverished country. They were falling into poverty because the economy was becoming ever more unequal. So the money was there, but it was increasingly skewed to the top of the economy. There were more billionaires in America than there ever had been. There were more multimillionaires. But an increasing number of Americans were losing their jobs, or they had jobs but they were losing their benefits. So they used to have health care, now they didn't. They used to have a pension, now they didn't. They used to have access to other social benefits, and those benefits were being rolled back as we move towards an economy increasingly based around service sector jobs.
We haven't seen this degree of concentrated income since the 1920s, and in some respects since the days of the robber barons, more than a century ago. If you look at that and see how much political power is concentrated at the top as well, because obviously money translates into political contributions, and political contributions give access to anybody who has that kind of money and has made those contributions, then you've got to wonder what happens to average people who don't have the access, who don't have that money.
Historically, democracy and capitalism have always been in a very uneasy relationship. In early centuries, for a period there, capitalism was a liberatory and democratic force in that it broke down the old traditions and feudal suffocations that existed. Now, those people who had no property were looked at with fear and loathing.
The country was formed in which, with a class of people that made up 20% of the country at its founding, who had no rights, who could demand nothing, who were not seen as human beings.
Then the women's movement came along, the minority movement came along, and they said, look, it doesn't really matter what you inherited. If you're not allowed to be educated, you're not allowed to vote, you're not allowed to own property, it doesn't really matter what you inherited. That became social determinism.
The history of the country, its economic history, its class history, its racial history, is shrouded in mythology. Actually, black folks, at least for a time, were doing much better during the 60s and the 70s and part of the 80s. But then we saw the general breakdown of the American industrial system. It was a dismantling of the industrial infrastructure of the country by Wall Street, by finance capital, as they exported the jobs to low-wage regions elsewhere in the world.
On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law.
Federal Reserve, you know, that criminal organization, against the Constitution, and nobody ever wants to talk about it. You know, the Federal Reserve, as people know, is as Federal Express. It's a private operation, created in 1913 on the eve of Christmas Eve, when nobody was in Washington. And you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Only Congress has the right to print and regulate the supply of money.
The Federal Reserve was set up by a coalition of banks. It was actually a Rockefeller-Morgan scheme. Have this Federal Reserve agency that would have the power to be the lender of last resort. The very same year, the 16th Amendment was passed, providing for an income tax, and the money originally went directly to the Federal Reserve to provide the interest to pay for this debt that was about to be incurred to the Federal Reserve, which was allowed to issue our money supply.
Wall Street, not Washington, runs the United States of America. And within Wall Street, the brain of Wall Street is Federal Reserve Bank. It is founded upon a belief in three things. Fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can create money out of thin air and lend it. You have compound interest, which is axiomatically creating more money out of thin air that has to be repaid. So there's no connection to reality. And probably the chief culprit is fiat currency, which says that money can be printed out of thin air and created. It's symbolic only. That's vastly different from monetary systems which governed earlier, and they weren't all perfect themselves, but they were better, in that they were connected to something tangible and real, i.e. a gold standard, a silver standard, a pound of sterling silver.
After 1971, when the dollar was taken off the gold standard, they sucked in the whole third world. Henry Kissinger supposedly had this secret agreement with the OPEC nations in which he said, I am going to make you very rich. We are going to quadruple the price of oil. But in return, you will sell your oil only in dollars, and you will deposit your dollars in our banks. So this did make the OPEC nations rich, and it also made the Wall Street banks rich, because anybody who needed the dollars to buy oil had to borrow from the Wall Street banks. All the countries in the world wound up borrowing from the Federal Reserve, and that was the beginning of this whole debt cycle in which third world countries have been trapped ever since.
Where does the money end up when the Fed prints a lot of additional money, when it undertakes quantitative easing? Well, a lot of the money actually goes to Wall Street. Wall Street can now get money almost free of charge, and that means that it, in turn, can utilize that money to buy all sorts of assets. The result is speculation, a big asset bubble, similar in many ways to the asset bubble we had in the middle 2000s.
It's a giant pyramid scheme. You have to continually be sucking new borrowers in at the bottom of the pyramid to keep the thing going. The Federal Reserve has encouraged one bubble after another, which is necessary to keep the banking system going.
They got to keep Wall Street going. They got to keep the money pump going. So let's lower interest rates down where you're not getting anything. So now those old folks out there that you didn't want to take any risk, now they're forced to take risk. Don't worry about it. Go to the stock market.
Because we're now down 43%.
Everything there completely wiped out. And the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
Waiting to see how low the Dow will go.
No risk. No, you just lose everything. And that's what many have lost. People forget the wipeout that happened from the panic of '08. Tens of trillions of dollars wiped off the map. And what are these poor people living on? Crumbs? Cat food?
This could be the most serious recession in decades. And that means life, as most Americans know it, is about to change, in some cases dramatically.
Buddy, can you spare a dime?
In the 18th century, for 100 years, the colonies issued their own money, and they flourished. The best of the experiments was in Pennsylvania. That was Benjamin Franklin's colony. The Pennsylvania colonists paid no taxes, had no government debt, and prices did not inflate. But we lost it when King George said the colonies could no longer issue their own money. Some historians said that that was actually what the revolution was all about. We didn't really care about this little tax on tea. What we were concerned about was that we had to pay taxes to England in their currency, which we didn't have. We were in the same position that Iceland and Latvia and Greece and the Philippines and all these other countries are in today, where they owe debts to a foreign power in a currency over which they have no control.
The Federal Reserve is the lobbying agency for the commercial banks. Commercial banks want to charge as much as they can on interest with no anti-usury laws. They want to make money on loans as much as they can, as long as they're able to sell loans to other parties without any responsibility for truth in what they're selling. They essentially were acting as criminals.
We need a whole new approach. And what I advocate is this. You take the Federal Reserve and you put it back under the control of Treasury. The 1913 Federal Reserve Act let the Federal Reserve be an independent agency, and frankly, they've served the interests of banks and corporations at the expense of jobs and the interests of small businesses throughout the United States. Take the Fed, put them under the Department of Treasury, eliminate the fractional reserve, make the banks have to go into business at 100% reserves, where they can't spend or loan money they don't have. And the third reform we need is, in order for our government to be able to dig our own way out of this ditch, we can't borrow money because people are going to say we're going to add to the debt. What we need to do is the government needs to take away from the Fed this power to create money and spend it in circulation, and the government needs to do that to invest in jobs. We could put millions of people back to work. The money is, we could create the money, spend it in the circulation, rebuild our roads, bridges, water system, sewer system, new mass transit, prime the pump of the economy, get America's economy going again. It's not as though there isn't a way to think our way out of this mess, and it's not as though we have to forever be a country that's strapped with debt.
Regimes imposed by the IMF, by Washington insiders, by the big banks, by the vulture financiers. We often forget that at the other end of these transactions are the people who just can't afford this. That this is bleeding the average person. And I'm talking about from the Congo to Bosnia to Detroit.
From the 1980s on, the IMF and the World Bank used the debt crisis that many countries in the global south were suffering under as leverage to impose neoliberalism. We've seen an expansion of this process to the global north, in Europe, in countries like Spain and Greece, that they have entered into economic crises, and that has opened the door for the IMF now to impose the same neoliberal policies on these European countries as it's imposed for the last 30 years on the global south, implementing austerity measures that are hugely unpopular, that have led to massive protests in the street, and the consequence of that is a diminished standard of living and more economic hardship for the majority of the population.
Western governments tax their citizens to fund the World Bank, lend this money to corrupt third world dictators who abscond with the funds and then demand repayment, which is extracted through taxation from the poor third world citizens, rather than from the government officials who are responsible for the embezzlement. It is in essence a global transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich.
Other countries that are now openly in revolt against the policies of the IMF and the central bankers, the central planners around the world, I would not say they've enjoyed any major successes so far. The only one exception, and that of course is Iceland. And Iceland was able to go after the bankers. They put bankers on trial. They've gone after former politicians. And as a result, the economy is doing a lot better than almost anywhere else in the world. What's happening in the UK right now at HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, or Royal Bank of Scotland in particular, they're participating in exactly the same fraud with the help and participation of the Bank of England. It's a program called quantitative easing, where the central bank loans the commercial banks to buy stock or bonds, in this case, in the central bank. So they are doing the exact same thing that in Iceland is a crime. The banking zones outside of Russia, Iran, China, and Iceland are all pretty much controlled by what's called or known as the Rothschild influence. But China, Russia, Iran, and Iceland, they're free to prosecute what I call these financial terrorists. We don't have that freedom in the UK because the bankers are protected by the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, the Federal Reserve in New York, who collude on a global basis to line the pockets of the criminals, in this case the bankers in the UK and America. And of course the economies are suffering catastrophically as a result of this. Poverty is on the rise and living standards in the UK are crashing worse than they have ever crashed going back to Victorian times.
The banking system is an utter failure. Nothing has failed more since 1929. We have to start asking, what value do these people produce for the rest of us? We have to start considering what we've now forgotten. We used to have a lot of state banks, regional banks. We may not need these giant banks. They're not too big to fail. They're really too useless to exist.
One state in the Union has its own bank, North Dakota. It is currently the only state that is able to meet its budget. All the rest are struggling, and some of them, like California, is desperately close to bankruptcy.
Not just breaking up the banks until they're small enough to fail, but going back to far smaller banks that are rooted in community and in community interests rather than in Wall Street interests.
Credit is just a series of legal agreements. There's no reason that we, the people, couldn't set up our own bank, our own publicly owned overseer of the legal agreements called credit, and get business rolling again.
The biggest Wall Street banks have consolidated their position on the street, and this does create the possibility, in fact, almost the near certainty, for another big bank bailout if one of those giant banks gets into trouble.
Since the planet's economy collapsed in the 1930s, we've had regulation in our country and elsewhere against manipulations of the financial market. And the first thing is we had a Securities Exchange Commission created by Franklin Roosevelt to prevent such things as commercial banks gambling and acting like what are investment banks. There was a division between them. It was called the Glass-Steagall Act. Back in 1998, Bill Clinton signed the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act at the urging of Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, and the big shots in the banking industry.
Robert Rubin, where was he before he went with Clinton as Treasury Secretary? Goldman Sachs. You mean the same Goldman Sachs that Henry Paulson, Bush's Treasury Secretary, was from? Oh yeah, and they were both CEOs and co-CEOs? Yeah, them. He deregulated it, Robert Rubin? He was a prime pusher, yeah, along with Larry Summers, who left the Obama administration.
The fact that you have a figure like Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary under Clinton, who deregulated our banking system, ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, creating the banking crisis.
So what's going to happen is we're going to sink lower and lower for years and years, and we're going to have these zombie banks, which you read about in the papers, means banks that really aren't banks. They're just, they're just little, shadows of the government, okay? And productivity is going to be, edge lower and lower. We're going to have huge inflation. Eventually, not now, but eventually, it's going to be rampant inflation from all the money that's being printed, and all because they won't let these companies fail.
The people who are responding are essentially trying to pump massive infusions of liquidity into a dying system.
Every bank manager, every fund manager knows that at some point a collapse is going to come. The key is, how are you going to protect yourself? And the way you protect yourself is you get the government to bail you out, and you plan this in advance. To get the government to bail you out, whereas it doesn't bail out the small businessman, doesn't bail out the individual who's bankrupt, is to owe so much money that you become essential to the system. And repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act enabled the banks and the investment banks and the insurance company and the crooked brokerage firms and the crooked law firms all to merge into a single unit and essentially be so large that if the government didn't bail them out, the whole economy would fall. So essentially, the repealers of Glass-Steagall said to the government and to the economy, your money or your life, and the idea was to make this irreversible.
Our government, in 24 hours, turned Goldman Sachs from an investment bank, a kind of financial casino, into a commercial bank with full government coverage. They got a check for $50 billion, which they don't have to pay back. They got $1 trillion in loan guarantees. That's just one bank. Citibank, even bigger, $2 trillion in loan guarantees. And who was put in charge of Citibank? Robert Rubin.
Investment banks are allowed to speculate and borrow 30 times the amount of actual capital they have in their pockets. How did that happen? The answer is that the heads of investment banks, including a guy who was head of Goldman Sachs named Henry Paulson, went to the Bush administration and said, let us leverage, let us be able to borrow many, many times the amount of money we have in our pockets. Don't worry, it's all safe, and the government doesn't have to back any of this. Boom, the whole thing collapsed. So who bails them out? The new Secretary of Treasury, Henry Paulson.
And if you listen to the critics, you realize that that whole system has to be restructured so that our economic system is not based on financial bubbles and financial scams.
Go back to the dot-com bust. $5 trillion was wiped out then. That was the 2000, March of 2000. And then fast forward a little more to 2008, when the panic of 08 hit. And then probably about another $8 or $10 trillion was lost. These are people's life savings that were lost. This is everything they had that was lost.
The fact is that our economy has had built into it business cycles that, lurch from boom to bust over, the centuries. This is not anything particularly new, and it seems as if we never learned the lessons from the past. What happened to Enron, what happened to WorldCom, to long-term capital, to all of the, scandals on Wall Street, they just tend to get repeated writ large.
I think that we can't understand where we are, how we got here, or how we might get out until we take a long, hard look at the housing bubble. And the housing bubble really began to go crazy as soon as the tech bubble burst. And the problem about having an economy that's claiming to have huge growth, which we've had for a long time, which is really the redistribution of wealth from the many to the few, and a series of speculative bubbles, is that you constantly have to have a new speculative fury. And the speculative fury was tech stocks and the internet and cell phones until about 2000, 2001, until that blew up violently. And this left people in need of a new bubble. Then we had September 11th, which to me shocked the public. What does President Bush tell America to do?
And I encourage you all to go shopping more.
Banks had this incentive to essentially
sell junk loans to people they had a pretty good idea would never realistically be able to pay them back. And the suffering at the bottom of the economy became something marketable. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie here.
And the banks got into the idea that they could bundle these mortgages and turn them into products that look like bonds, which are safe because they're collateralized. In other words, if you don't pay, they can seize your house. And so they thought, look, houses are probably intrinsically pretty stable. It's a way to loan to a public desperate for credit, whose wages are in no way, shape, or form covering their expenses. It's a bonanza.
In about 2006, 2007, is the housing bubble bursts. It doesn't just gently slide to a halt, it explodes. And it creates an awful lot of collateral damage. People who had thought they would always be able to borrow against the rising value of their home found they could no longer go into debt. And if they couldn't go into debt, they couldn't pay all their bills. So they start juggling. Do I pay my health bills this month? Do I let my utilities bills slide? Do I put food on the table?
New rules by the World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, various agreements. The United States, American banks, could tap for the first time the savings of the whole world. That money can then be brought back to the United States and it can be made in a safe, no-lose loan to housing.
Now, when everything started going south, it started going south very, very quickly. People who thought they were buying into the American dream found that what they were really doing was signing their way into bankruptcy, essentially. They were signing away their life savings. They were paying too much for property that realistically should never have been valued at the rates that it reached in 2004, 2005, 2006. The banks were setting up their clients for a fall. When the fall came, the government wasn't ready to ease the landing. So these guys were falling from a great height and they were landing hard.
Americans were doing about $500 billion a year in something called mortgage equity withdrawal. And that is borrowing out the nominal increase in the prices. The problem is the price goes up, the price goes down. The money you borrow, you must pay back. So if your house price goes up and you borrow more and then it goes down, you're underwater.
Entire communities sliding into poverty. And this is something that's going to be with us for a generation. Because when you lose a community, it takes tremendous effort to rebuild that community. It destroys neighborhoods, and it especially destroys neighborhoods of poor people.
A lot of the destruction began under Bill Clinton's administration. And for example, not only deregulation of the financial markets, but the so-called push for free trade. We have agreements, the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. And we have the World Trade Organization and what is called most favored trading nation trading status with China. 3 massive trade deals that were kicked off in the Clinton administration, which we are paying for right now in Treasury and in unemployment.
NAFTA has proved devastating for the poor in Mexico and for the working and middle class in the United States. In Mexico, for example, under NAFTA, more than 2 million farmers have been forced to quit farming. And this is because heavily subsidized U.S. agricultural products, particularly corn, have flooded the Mexican market under NAFTA. And Mexican farmers cannot compete with the cheap subsidized U.S. imports, so they've been forced out of farming. At its height in 2000, NAFTA had only created 700,000 jobs, and yet 2 million Mexican farmers were displaced.
Right after the passage of NAFTA, almost every single auto parts maker in the United States went bankrupt. There was no way to compete with cheap, nearly slave labor in Mexico. It couldn't be done. We went from a $5 billion a year trade surplus with Mexico to a $45 billion deficit with Mexico, a swing of $50 billion. As an economist, I can tell you that costs about 500,000 jobs right there.
We would never allow one state in this country to suck industry and jobs into that state because it has a minimum wage of $1 an hour. Why are we allowing China to get in that same position?
We gave them what was called most favored trading status. What that meant is that Basically, we bought from China. We didn't buy and sell, we bought and bought. We don't really buy from China. We buy from the Walmart factories in China. Walmart has 700 factories in China. So we actually have a trade deficit with Walmart. That's our big problem, disguised as so-called free trade with China.
Every cheap product in the United States, many of them anyway, come from China. That allowed American companies in every field to pay Americans less and still have them be able to buy enough to live. The really cheap Chinese stuff that Americans have been buying has artificially supported their standard of living.
So we send the money out. We now have to borrow it back. A massive, massive cost of borrowing back from China. We are now borrowing and indebted to China for $1 trillion, draining our economy, bleeding us white to basically pay the Chinese landlord to get our own money back. So people have to understand, when we talk about free trade, it's not free at all.
They started shifting the focus to trade agreements, eliminating any regulations or restrictions on corporate control of resources, corporate control of trade. So instead of governments setting rules, it was turned over to Wall Street corporations in the service of their own profits without regard to national consequences and beyond the reach of accountability to governmental intervention and a public interest.
Instead of having global trade agreements where we pull up countries like India and China by having a basic minimum wage, living wages, and other processes as a condition of receiving their imports from these countries. That's a pull-up trade agreement. We have a pull-down trade agreement. Why? Because corporations are looking all over the world for the most concessionary autocratic regime that will give them mineral concessions and other franchises in return for bribes. And they're looking for serf labor that's crushed by these regimes in tax havens where they get away with paying minimal tax.
When those who operate Wall Street allow greed and rampant capitalism to distort the financial well-being of this country and in turn the rest of the world, the consequences overseas are quite horrific. And we see the human rights of real people being impacted in the developing countries, but also in Europe, in the developed world, where we have inherited and bought into American capitalism.
And those people are damaged, losing their homes, losing their lives. And like I say, what they practice in the Congo, the victims I see there, it's coming back to the U.S. as they make the entire U.S. the third world. It used to be that capitalists would make money when things lived, when they sold things. Now, the guys that make the most money, like a Paul Singer, who's worth about $7 billion, he makes 100% of his money when nations and cities and industries die.
Capitalism has always depended on shocks in order to move forward its agenda. Now, sometimes these shocks could occur for natural reasons. US government aid to these countries, whether it's international organizations providing bailout loans to the IMF or development loans to the World Bank to these countries that have experienced a natural disaster. Along with all these bailout funds and this aid come the conditions that they have to open up their country's resources and their cheap labor to multinational investment. Sometimes the capitalists and corporations will actually initiate the shocks themselves, or more likely the governments that promote their agenda, like the United States. And this was essential to ensure that the newly emerging factories had workers, because much of the peasantry had no desire to voluntarily leave the land and go and work in the miserable conditions of the factories and live in the poverty that existed in the cities. So it required some kind of shock take place.
Since this new economic model of corporate globalization was put in place in 1995 with the coming into force of the World Trade Organization, the corporations are even dreaming of a so-called green economy where every blade of grass, the tiniest of leaves in a forest, will become their property, converting the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere into oxygen so we as humans can live. is a function they want to own, financialize, and play on the global casino with. Corporations have gone blind to life. Corporations are extinguishing life. We have gone beyond poverty. We are now facing a threat of extinction as a species.
Globalization. This is a phenomenon that is affecting every single person on Earth, and we see the meltdown directly related to the risk that were created by our banking system then spreads throughout the world once you have a globalized system controlled by a few. That's true in banking, and it's true in virtually every other industry where we see this kind of concentration. So it is really a system problem, and we have to see it as a system problem.
The beginning of poverty is the beginning of exploitation, where colonialism sucked out the resources that allowed people to provide for themselves. And then the colonial model was entrenched into the new economy, defined on the basis of GDP, the gross domestic product, and a mindset based on civilization defined as the looting and grabbing of other people's resources. Poverty is the underside of exploitation. It is not a state of nature. It is not a state of indigenous cultures. That is why when Gandhi was asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" he smiled and said, "It would be a good idea, because to be civilized means to live and let live, to ensure others have prosperity, and your prosperity is not based on grabbing from them."
International institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, these are unelected institutions. Their representatives are unaccountable, and what they've done over the last 30 years is use the debt crisis that many countries in the global south found themselves in as the leverage to impose neoliberal reforms or austerity measures on these countries.
100 years ago, countries like India were ruled by the British Empire. In 1942, we experienced one of the worst famines in recorded human history, the Great Bengal Famine. It wasn't because there wasn't enough rice, but because the rice was being taken away both to finance the war and make profits from trade. By 1947, we got independence, fueled by the anger of famine in the middle of plenty. India came out of the famine situation, and we were providing for ourselves. Then you get globalization. First through the World Bank and IMF structural adjustment, and later through the World Trade Organization rules of free trade. Every fourth Indian is hungry. Every second child in India is wasted and so severely malnourished that they will never ever grow to be full human beings mentally and physically. And meantime, an exploitative agriculture system that has reduced the world to a marketplace, that has turned seed into the intellectual property of Monsanto, that has turned trade into a monopoly of the Cargills, has pushed Indian peasants who were self-sufficient, who led a dignified life. Today, 284,000 Indian farmers have committed suicide because of the exploitative economy related to globalization and so-called free trade, which is only free for giant corporations, but means slavery for the peasants of India and every other part of the world.
The structural adjustment was a response to countries getting in over their head into international debt, a process that was actively driven by the World Bank and by many global players.
If I go back to my time as an economic hitman in the 1970s, I see that my job was really to create an empire, the world's first truly global empire, and to create it primarily without the military. You take a country like Bolivia, and so we would get loans to be made to, let's say, the water and sewage system of Cochabamba. And then money never went to Bolivia. It went from the World Bank in Washington, D.C. to a corporation someplace in the United States, Bechtel, for example, in California, or Brown and Root in Texas, what happens is that the system can't pay for itself because the Bolivian government is trying to provide water to all of its people, which in Andean tradition and in Bolivian tradition is considered to be a right. Water belongs to everybody. They're trying to honor this. But the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the International Monetary Fund are saying, you can't do this, you can't subsidize, everybody has to pay. And when that wasn't happening, the decision was made then to turn the whole system over to a U.S. corporation. And in this particular case, Bechtel Corporation, non-compete contract, they end up owning the Cochabamba water system. And now they're charging tremendous amounts of money for water, even for the poorest of the poor. You weren't even allowed to catch water in buckets on your roof without being charged for it, because that was illegal. People of Cochabamba rebelled, and they took back their system. But these sorts of things have happened over and over again.
What we do is dispossess people of their capacity to support themselves, to meet their basic needs. Places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Asia, as a result of this dispossession of lands, we now have, for example, 3 million children who die every year from hunger-related diseases.
They either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Both Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama were assassinated because I and other economic hitmen couldn't corrupt them, couldn't get them to buy into the system. President Zelaya of Honduras implemented policies, or tried to implement policies, that Dole, Chiquita, Cargill, Kraft didn't approve of. They were going to increase wage rates significantly and have land reform that would impact their farms there. He was taken out by a Honduran general who was trained in the School of the Americas and by the CIA.
Latin America is turning away from the United States. It's turning to a much more socialist approach to government. It's rejecting privatization in many countries. I think it's a revolution that's happening in Latin America, and it's very interesting to see. And I think and hope it's directed where it should be directed, that is at the needs of basic fundamental people who are what it's all about. People are why we're in business, why we're in government. It's not to make money, it's not for privatization, it's not to feed the wealthy and the corporations. It's to look after the well-being of individuals.
There's a structural genocide that is resulting in the deaths of more than 10 million people annually, needlessly, because they can't access their basic needs. The logic of the capitalist system guarantees that millions every year will die because of the way the system works. And this is fundamentally immoral.
American mainstream media and the press has yet to give us any stories, human interest stories, talking about what is it now, 4 million, 5 million families who have lost their homes? I think the number is larger than that, the people who are homeless. Where have they gone?
Intensity. They made it through the first polar vortex freeze. They're now preparing for today's snowstorm and the freeze for the rest of the week. I talked to Minister Steve, who runs the group and makes sure that everyone has everything that they need.
Just making sure that everybody is warm and has their tent in good shape.
Police have come in there. They have towed out his school bus that he drives.
Arresting me twice on trumped-up charges. So again, the harassment of the powers that be, just trying to push out the poor for no good reason. It was just last November, just before the election, police rolled into Tent City, about 3 cars strong, and they started peeling out their wheels, slamming on their brakes, whipping their spotlight around. They jumped out of their car, went up to the first tent where a 72-year-old woman was residing. She was using her wood stove to stay warm. It was probably about 35 degrees. The police came to the door and said, "Put out your wood stove or we're going to give you a ticket." And the woman says, I want to stay warm. It's cold out there. They wrote her out a ticket. There's a tremendous amount of lack of concern here, in our society. It's discrimination by design. It's class discrimination, discrimination against the poor, and they're doing it on purpose. They erode the freedoms and liberties of the poor, of our community. They're going to just continue to widen that, to the lower middle class, and they're going to continue to oppress the people. And so what it is, we've got to level the playing field.
Nobody saw the victims of the Great Depression until people like Woody Guthrie started writing songs describing what they were living through. No grasp of the anger, the resentment that's building, the fate of Les Miserables who are out there, just trying to survive and tired of being ignored and not being seen.
We came from New York City, from Queens, Jamaica Estates. We lived in an apartment there for 11 years. My wife was a top textile designer in New York. For example, Robert Allen Company, which existed for 30 years. Her designs were in Target and Lowe's and Kmart, $1 million design. When my wife lost her job, we had no place to turn.
Basically, when the economy went, a lot of things went with it, and a lot of jobs and a lot of other things like that, So when the money stops rolling in, eventually you can't pay bills, and eventually you're on the street. And that's what happens to most families and most people.
In America, more than 90% of the 25 million Americans forced to go to soup kitchens and food pantries aren't homeless. They have homes. They're just too poor to be able to afford all the food their families need. They're a senior citizen who doesn't earn enough from Social Security to pay their rent, to pay their mortgage, and get all the food and prescriptions they need. It's a child. About half the people hungry in America forced to go to pantries and kitchens or use the food stamps program are children. It's working parents who are working at the minimum wage, a little over $14,000 a year for full-time work, and still can't afford to feed their families. Food stamps benefit pays about $1 a meal. It is incredible hypocrisy of the society to make it far harder for working families to get food stamps for themselves and for their children than for corporate leaders to get billions and billions and billions in corporate welfare.
I used to consider myself middle class. There's no middle class anymore. It's rich and poor. That's it. I don't consider myself middle class. I was looking forward to retire, and I was forced to retire at 62. I rent a room because I can't afford my rent. It's a $1,500 apartment. So I rent the room. By the 15th, I have no money to eat. I have to go to a senior center to eat. I never thought that retirement would be this bad. It's so depressing, in this city. And I don't think people see that, People make a little money, they think, wow, everybody's like that. No. How many seniors out there with pensions and Social Security, they can't even pay for food? I'm barely making it every day. I'm really embarrassed that I worked since I was 16 years old, and I'm 65, and I'm suffering. What kind of retirement is this? Well, I expect 5 years from now, where would I be? Because we don't know if they're going to deduct Social Security. We don't know if the city decides to cut my pension.
Homelessness it's a terrible thing. But we've gotten so in this society that it's almost like, well, people are homeless. So what?
I became homeless in 91 after 9/11. I came back to New York from California, and I was hoping to live with a family member. And due to an argument, I ended up in the street. And I lived in the street for many years. I connected with other homeless people. They considered us the elite homeless. We tried not to look homeless. We kept our appearance up, but just being in the street on a regular basis it was a nightmare. You get up at the crack of dawn, you go one place to eat breakfast, you haven't even washed up yet. So now you gotta go halfway across town to take a shower somewhere. We travel more in a day than most people do in a week. And then the sleeping arrangements. I initially slept on the trains. I felt that was the safest and smartest thing to do. So a monthly Metro card was basically like paying rent for me. And you were protected from the elements. You sat up all the time, and you always feared being arrested. Other people slept outside, cardboard boxes, that sort of thing.
You know, I slept in cemeteries, slept in subways, in parks, anywhere where I would feel safe and away from prying eyes. We don't exist to people. People would be amazed how many homeless get hurt and killed out there. Maybe then there would be more of an outcry.
This is no place for someone to live on the street with the kind of poverty, with the kind of need that so many people have. It's going to continue to get worse.
But the system is not helping. The system wants to keep you down. The money that they make in the system, in the shelter system, they won't help you get a house. They won't help you to get housing that costs that amount of money. But somebody else is getting a kickback from receiving those residuals. They don't want to help people. They don't really want to help you. I was burnt out and I had to move. I moved to the South because they said it was better, but actually it was worse. That's where I became officially homeless in Atlanta, Georgia. And what they said it is and how it is really not. And I came back here because this is my home. And I could get my footing back here. And I did, but they didn't help me.
All you see is what's around you, and a place to go to the bathroom, I need that now, or a place to get your face washed in the library, and a place to crash out, you know, and sleep so that you can get up the next morning and do whatever people do. And most of the time, the homeless people never plan to be homeless. It's just that one day when I'm not paying attention because life is so sad and filled full of crisis that I don't want to see the bill that I have to pay to keep my apartment, and I don't want to know what's going to happen tomorrow because I already know. I just don't want to look at it. It's too painful.
Question on poverty and how it got so outrageous. It's really a story of debt and debt saturation. And also you have an entire industry, that is to say Wall Street, that's dedicated to expanding the debt. So they're actually working at cross purposes with the economy as a whole.
The real reason that our people are going bankrupt in the numbers they are is because Americans' wages haven't gone up in 30 years. It costs more to be middle class than you earn if you're middle class. And we haven't worked out these basic problems, and one of the ways that expresses itself is in bankruptcy.
Now, this is a terrible system, really. It's created something that I call predatory capitalism. It's about putting people deep into a debt that they can't get out of, and then you gut them by the claws.
You're on your own, and the poor aren't, the straggly hobos. The poor are those college kids. They're really poor. They're getting out of school with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. They sucker them into getting these degrees in worthlessness that they owe for the rest of their lives. They passed bankruptcy laws that you would never be able to get out of. You're an indentured servant when you go to college and you get out and you can't find a job. You have to pay off that debt. You're not getting out of it.
In passing the Bankruptcy Reform Bill of 2005 makes it harder for most Americans to get bankruptcy protection. It doesn't allow you, to get bankruptcy protection for credit card debt, for example. Some $156 million was spent on lobbying for this one piece of legislation. The credit card companies were complaining that people were not paying their bills and that we're getting away with something. There was fraud going on in the system. When actually the biggest fraud is that the credit card companies themselves.
Americans became dependent on their credit cards. They are paying 18 to 30% on average on their credit card balances to banks, many of whom are borrowing from the federal government for 0.5 of 1%. So it's a very profitable industry.
Many people have 10 credit cards or more in order to basically keep their lifestyles going. interest compounds. It gets more and more expensive. And as that happens, people are getting deeper and deeper in debt, falling behind. And we've seen more and more credit card defaults, more and more car repossessions, and of course, more and more foreclosures.
You're not going to get out of the debt. You are a slave to the government. But I'll give you a break. You want a break? I'll give you a break. Join the army. Join the military. And don't worry, look, if you get in a little trouble in jail, we'll get you out too. We'll send you to war.
Those are two big industries, by the way, that are still left in America. The army and prison. Yeah, really big industries here. And we need to fill the army, we need to fill prison. And I think that's why we have a 60% graduation rate, and education sucks. And yeah, if you're not educated, you get to go to one or two places usually, or, maybe work at the airport.
The U.S. economy has become what I call a prison gulag economy. The fastest growing industries are the prison industries. The fastest growing populations are the prison populations.
There are more people in prison today than there were slaves in 1850 in this country. Debtors' prisons are making a comeback here. People are going to prison, going to jail because they can't pay their bills. We put more people in prison, keep them there longer than any other industrial country in the world. We are 5% of the world's population. We are 25% of the prison population. We have close to 2.5 million people in prison. We've put $300 billion over the last 30 years into the prison system. Corporate America has taken over more and more of these prisons, saying they're going to run them as businesses more efficiently, and yet we find that what they're doing is making money off these people.
A mass project like this, requiring huge investments in capital to make these prisons and to staff them, generates a lot of profit. And we can see how that would accelerate a tendency which began in terms of social control and then sustains itself because of profit.
When you come out of prison and you have a felony on your record, or you have a burglary, it's almost impossible to get another job. So what we do is we don't have, again, a clean transitional system out of prison. So for many individuals, when they come out, then they truly cannot have a job. And so then they go back to crime. And people go, well, I don't understand why they did that. Well, the choices weren't there.
Prison stocks are some of the most lucrative stocks on the market. They are making money, and people are investing in it, and it's huge business.
Get them outside, let them earn some money, get some fresh air, a little exercise. But really what they're doing is they're farming for supermarkets. It's fascinating. Hey, if you want a job, go to jail.
It's exactly the situation we had back in the late 1870s, 1880s in America, where there was open use of prison populations as slave labor. So slave labor is in the mix once again, coming back to a fabulous American casino gulag shtetl of your choice.
Make it for free and sell it for all you can, It's all about that, once again, the bottom line, man, profit, profit, profit. There's a lot of that going on in China. People are being arrested and put in jail for absolutely nothing except to make socks.
The corporate world out there sees this as another vehicle to exploit, to crush people, to keep them in line, if you will.
So as the system breaks down, the response is more laws and more order for the folks at the bottom.
I live in California, Orange County, California. I'm homeless right now. Actually, I live most of the time in LA County, because LA County is not as strict on the homeless as Orange County is. Orange County tends to write tickets for people who are sleeping in the parks or wherever they can, and makes it a crime to be homeless.
Impunity increases for those at the top who are too big to jail, and punishment increases for those at the bottom. That is a formula for fascism.
just in Detroit. I met with family of a United Auto Workers member, Robert Pratt. Pratt had 5 kids. Now he's got 4. One got a bullet in the head and died, 12 years old, in the 8 Mile neighborhood of Detroit. Because there's no city services, no protection anymore. He knows that because his wife lost her job with the city of Detroit when it went bankrupt. Why did it go bankrupt? Because a bunch of financial finaglers took down General Motors and the big Delphi auto parts operation in Detroit, moved 35,000 jobs to China. And they get lauded on Wall Street, including one Mitt Romney who pulled in over $4 billion on taking down General Motors, put it in their pockets. The deal made through the so-called bailout. Well, Robert Pratt wasn't bailed out and he's losing his home because he was given a mortgage by the Bank of America subsidiary Countrywide. Started out as 4%, and then despite interest rates falling, the automatic interest hikes tripled his mortgage payments. No one could pay for that. It was $100,000 on a home that's worth $30,000 on a good day. These are the victims. He's lost his kid, he's going to lose his home, and that's Detroit.
Something else has happened in Detroit that adds to the misery of being deprived of employment. And that is now, because Detroit not having a tax base anymore and surrounded by hostile municipalities and now a very hostile state government under Republican control, now Detroit's voters have been deprived of the effective right to vote. So that by electoral means, there is no hope of them not using the ballot, pulling themselves and their city out of crisis. So in Detroit, if that is a model for the country, and I think it is, if Detroit is that model, then pulling America out of its crisis is something that is possibly beyond electoral strategies.
America used to make steel. Then the steel industry started going down, and the steel companies were bankrupted. They were bought up by Wilbur Ross, several of them that went into bankruptcy. The workers' contracts, union contracts, were ripped up. Workers were told to take 1/3 of their union pay. Their pensions were loaded onto the U.S. government. We have something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, so you and I as taxpayers took over the pensions. What happened was that Wilbur then stuck all these steel companies together and sold them as a monopoly lump to the Mittal family of India. Wilbur, all he did was offload pensions, destroy union contracts, make no steel. He earned $1 billion payday. And what we ended up with was workers losing their money, losing their pensions, losing their security, and America got stuck with the bill.
Business organizations accepted the fact that there were going to be unions and we're going to try to sort of marginalize them around the edges and we're going to try to exert more power and restrict their ability, but we acknowledge their right to exist. Right? The fact that that most basic of bargains has been eroded over the last 30 to 40 years is what makes this particular moment that much more difficult, that much harder to understand how it's going to get better, right? Particularly for the folks who are worst off, for whom there's just less and less by way of place to turn.
The power elite itself was able to begin to wrench apart the regulations, the safeguards, the legislation, and the protection that had created an American middle class, and not only that, but a prosperous working class.
One of the things that employers did was they revived a kind of business that hadn't existed in the United States through the Second World War and the immediate following years. That business was the union-busting firm. The Pinkertons are the most famous of them. They had armies of goons and spies to break strikes and to spy on workers. That kind of union-busting company faded with the emergence of this brief, short-lived social compact between business and labor. But it reemerged in the 1970s. But now the union-busting companies didn't hire goons. What they hired were lawyers and public relations experts to scare workers.
Think about the struggles of Martin Luther King, who was associated with civil rights. But King understood that civil rights don't mean squat unless you have economic rights. That's why he moved his base from Atlanta to Chicago. There was no rule that said that black people in Chicago couldn't vote or couldn't use the same water fountains as white people. They just couldn't afford to live where white people live, so they never drank their water, right? It was economic power. When Martin Luther King was shot, he wasn't on a civil rights demonstration. He was leading a march for the union organizing rights of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. He was saying, you have to go beyond the rights you have in law because of the color of your skin, and we have to start talking about the rights we have as human beings to dignified work, to dignified pay, and the right to survive. That was King's message, and that was the message that was cut short by the bullets. He said, we have a bigger goal, a tougher goal. He said, call it socialism if you want, but I'm going to tell you right now that the #1 issue in America is economic justice.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
The answers to poverty and homelessness and all the negative ramifications that ensue from that dilemma are multidimensional. We can start with the subversion of the 14th Amendment, where we created this monstrosity called the American corporate entity, where corporations are blessed with all the rights as individual people that individuals have. However, they don't have the same social responsibilities that we have. So we have multinational corporations incorporated in the state of Delaware, where they are immune from any kind of social consciousness or monitoring, and the profit motive has taken us away from our American credo.
For the first 100 years that the United States was a country, no corporation could get a charter unless it could prove that it was going to serve the public interest. Charters lasted on average for 10 years, and then the corporation had to go back and prove it had served the public interest, and would continue to do so in order to renew its charter. That all changed in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court decided that corporations had the rights but not the responsibility of individuals.
You know, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, one of the most dangerous things we could do in America is permit the creation of corporations. It's not that he was anti-capitalist. This is not Karl Marx. This is Thomas Jefferson. He's concerned, though, about creating this weird legal entity which had no responsibility.
The very corporate forces that are cannibalizing the country are, on a wider scale, cannibalizing the planet because they exist, or they turn everything into a commodity to exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And they're relentless. There's no way to stop them.
It's runaway corporate power concentrated in fewer and fewer giant corporations. And they broke the back of the series of restraints on their power that had been built up in the progressive populist period in our history over a century ago.
The corporate state has burrowed its way so deeply into the foundations of government as to suck it dry. It's completely parasitic. That's why they ripped down the trade barriers so that they could all set up like Halliburton, which exists on taxpayer funds, and it sets up all its subsidiaries in Dubai so that it doesn't have to pay taxes.
They organize production to keep themselves in charge and keep everybody else kind of out of the picture. They take a part of the profits and they use it to shape politics, to give money to politicians, to pay for lobbyists, to fund think tanks that explain that all of this is really good for all of us, this system.
Corporate welfare is a huge issue and very cleverly hidden by a corporate media from the American public. I mean, that's what the so-called healthcare reform bill is. It's $400 billion in subsidies to the for-profit pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. The oil and natural gas industry is another one. Agribusinesses, the defense industry. I mean, talk about a swindle. They sign a contract and then they're guaranteed all their cost overruns. It's not even capitalism. I'm not sure what it is.
Well, it's corporate socialism. Socialism is government ownership of the means of production. Capitalism is corporate ownership of the means of government. So basically, corporations have taken over our government. In fact, we should never talk about government in Washington without using the adjective corporate government. They control every agency, every department, and the bulk of members of Congress. There's not much left. And Washington is corporate occupied territory. It, in effect, allows these corporations, the bigger they are, to smash their way through to maximizing their bonuses, maximizing their sales. And if the two conflict, they will sink their own company as long as they can get away with golden parachutes at the top of the company.
Most people think of the economy as being about credit, being extended to build factories that employ happy workers walking through the gates, increasing the means of production, and increasing living standards. That was industrial capitalism. It was replaced by finance capitalism, where instead of the economy being about people buying and selling goods and services, it's about captains of industry buying and selling entire companies.
Before capitalism became the dominant system, we had other systems. Feudalism was one, slavery was another, people living in tribal villages was another, and guess what? After long periods of time, the people living with those economic systems reached the conclusion that they were no longer acceptable. They didn't serve the needs of the community, so they gave up a system and went to another one. We have a system that doesn't work anymore. And we are a nation that is afraid to say that, afraid to have a debate over that.
The corporations can't exist if you don't have people, because the people buy from the corporations, and you bail out them, and how are we gonna exist? You did not bail us out. We don't have housing, we don't have enough food, we don't have jobs. School, what's going on? What's really going on? I wanna know, because it's not gonna work like this.
You can't cope with a crisis if you don't recognize that the crisis exists. And we are a society utterly awash in lies. We are fed electronic hallucinations that tell us that reality is never an impediment to what we want. We can have everything we desire. If we just find our inner strength, we'll get what we want. And this is magical thinking. The conscious dumbing down of America, the way that the commercial media has rendered gigantic portions of this country virtually invisible. We don't know how the people in Camden live. We have no idea how they live. Or Detroit or East New York or the cold out areas of West Virginia. We don't see these pictures.
News has become propaganda and it's not connected to reality. If they came down and spent a week in Camden and live in a poor house and try to live for the week on what, Mrs. Jones is making, then they might understand something, but they don't understand,
It's just too cozy. I mean, we've got the same people who run the media are also the same people who are running corporations, who are the same people who are manufacturing weapons, and to find that warfare is a very profitable enterprise.
The people who control the corporations that control those images make sure that those images carry an ideological imprint. And it's one that effectively severs the people entranced by these images from reality. On a cruder scale, it's precisely what the arena did in ancient Rome, and Cicero wrote all about it, all the time. That the spectacle of the arena had poisoned political and civil discourse. It had filled people's minds with garbage, and that's how you end up with a Caligula or a Nero.
One of the largest contexts for both greed and poverty in the United States today is to understand the notion of America as empire, what historians call the imperial arc of empire is fundamental to understanding the greed and rapaciousness that's emanating from Wall Street.
The corporate state has appropriated for itself legal mechanisms by which, at the flick of a switch, they can turn this country into a dictatorship.
There it goes there, now firing onto the crowd. Ouch! Completely unprovoked attack on citizens. Now fires in the yard right next to the houses. The police department is firing on the crowd without care for personal property or damage.
We don't even have habeas corpus. We have been shorn of any kind of protection. It has become legal to crush all forms of dissent.
Thanks to new legislation and Supreme Court rulings, now anybody can contribute, any corporation, as much money as they want to a political candidate. So it's not only Wall Street in the USA. It could be any company from around the world, any multinational that wants to give your politician the money to pass the laws that he wants or she wants. Now they can do it. This is not a representative form of government. It's represented by the multinationals and by the big campaign contributors. And these aren't campaign contributions, they're bribes and payoffs.
Right now, in America, the entire government has been turned into an engine that accelerates the wealth of America upwards. Our monetary policies take money from the mass of people and put it into the hands of a few. Our trade policies take money from the mass of people and put it into the hands of a few. War takes money from the mass of people, puts it in the hand of a few.
The war in Iraq, which people don't think about, was almost exclusively funded with borrowed money. The Bush administration went on a borrowing bonanza. In other words, basically George Bush managed to double the total indebtedness of the federal government in his 8 years as president. More or less, another way to think of that is the United States ran up about the same amount of national debt between 1783 and 2001 as it did between 2001 and 2009. And that is a rather staggering expansion.
Just think of what this country could look like if that $3 to $5 trillion was invested wisely in infrastructure, in real education, not the system that we have now, in really growing this country.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Eisenhower warned the people of the military-industrial complex taking over the country. By the time the Cold War stopped, $13 trillion had been spent. On what?
Then they turn around and say, well, we have to cut these programs that we can't afford. Of course, that always turns out to be programs that might benefit poor people or people who are struggling with the consequences of Wall Street's economic policies, which push down wages, push people off of health care or out of retirement programs and anything else that might make it possible for them to live.
They completely eliminated what they called $100 billion of unnecessary bling, unstimulating, useless expenditures. So they cut out the food stamps.
And in return for fundraisers and campaign cash, they will turn their back on the people of this country and do the bidding of a tiny slice of very rich people and a few giant corporations.
The bills of our nation are being run up without us really having any say in it. Wars, trillions of dollars going for wars that are unnecessary. Over $1 trillion given to banks and Wall Street corporations. So banks take that money, they park their investments at the Fed. They earn interest on it while businesses in our districts throughout America are starved for capital and are laying off people.
So for rich people, let's follow the logic. By refusing to pay taxes to the government, they force the government to borrow to borrow from them the money that they didn't pay in taxes. So from the standpoint of a wealthy American, of a big corporation, they avoid taxation and in the same act create for themselves a wonderful investment. If the government taxed it, end of story. It had the money, it could make the expenditures. Instead, it borrows from corporations and the rich to make the same expenditures. But now, saddling everybody else and future generations with the burden of having to pay that money back with interest to the same corporations and rich people whose avoidance of tax forced the whole issue into the air.
Now, why does 60% of America not want these people to be taxed? Well, guess what? I talked to a psychologist about it, and you know what he told me? Because 60% of America seems to think it's going to hit that 1% someday and it won't have to pay taxes. My country's delusional. We all want to be multimillionaires, and we all seem to think we're going to be multimillionaires while the country's getting poorer by the second.
What type of person goes to work on Wall Street? I think you'd have to say these are people that are mostly in search of lots of money. And when they start making money, that's when the problems start. It's this endless pursuit of what they believe is going to fill them up and make them feel good, which is endless supplies of money, but it never does.
Yeah, I think the people who work in these big Wall Street investment houses and banks and so on get a colossal sense of entitlement. Someone once called it narcissistic self-entitlement.
They feel this hollowness, they go out and buy things to try to fill them up. They buy Ferraris, they buy $2,000 suits, they go out for super expensive dinners, they rent houses in the Hamptons. Once they have that, then they take a, whew, I still feel empty, what do I do now? So now they look for the next step. They got to only make more money, you can get even, a bigger house in the Hamptons and start flying in private jets.
No, I think something much more severe is needed than mere tightening of regulations. I think something far more dramatic is needed to bring some sense of control over those people. I don't know what it is, but I don't think that sense of entitlement is going to be easily eradicated.
Well, instead of thinking of Wall Street as the great engine of wealth creation, much more accurate to think of Wall Street as a criminal syndicate.
And all you people that gave your sweat and blood thinking that all you had to do was go into work every day, do the best that you could do, be a good corporate soldier, and you would be rewarded. Bam, there goes your pension, there goes your benefits, there goes your retirement, into their pocket before they blow the company out. How many jobs have been lost in this country over the last 30 years because of these leveraged buyouts and these slimy hedge fund dealers? Some 30 million.
Anything on Wall Street seems too good to be true, it is. There's nothing given out for free on Wall Street except for the people that run the firms. They run the casinos. You are just a gambler in their world. And when you go to the casinos, right, you look at these beautiful buildings, they weren't built by winners. They're built by losers.
The whole economy's been turned into a vehicle for bettors, and nobody knows who's making the bets, whether they're making them on the winning side or the losing side. It's all opaque because the government says if people have to tell you what they're betting, it's going to be an interference with the freedom of secrecy. If one person wins and the interest rates or currency goes one way, then somebody else loses because they have to cover the loss. The problem for Wall Street is, what do you do to enable the winners to collect? Wall Street keeps all the winning bets on its own side. The losing bets are put over to the government to bail out the bad bettors, and everybody's made whole. The winners get to collect on these huge bets they've made, far in excess of the actual volume of foreign currency, so that they're supposed to be about a $4 quadrillion worth of bets that are placed, maybe 10 or 20 times as big as the global economy itself.
I think at a certain point when you cross over to the dark side of the force, you just like nothing is taboo anymore.
What started in America last year has now spread to every part of the world.
We're down 9% today. The Xetra DAX over in Frankfurt is down by 9%. The Paris market down by 9%. Austria.
It looked really great when all these big firms on Wall Street were trading these derivatives, and these, issuing these credit default swaps, taking in nothing but money and being perceived as the ultimate masters of the universe while times were good. And meanwhile, everyone was just looking the other way, sacrificing any ethical or moral responsibility in the pursuit of short-term profits.
In 2008, in the closing months of the Bush presidency, we had 1929 all over again. Although such was the corruption of the system this time, that neither George W. Bush nor Barack Obama really lifted a finger, as Roosevelt did, to begin a reformation of the system. Instead, what the Financial Reform Act that was passed in early 2010 enacted was that the government is now legally mandated to bail Wall Street out. Under George W. Bush, it was what the government did, but there was no legal requirement to do so. So therefore, George Bush and Barack Obama could have done what Roosevelt did and said, listen, you guys have completely forfeited your responsibilities ethically and financially to the American people. They didn't do that. They now have made it by law a legal mandate of the federal government to bail out the system the next time it breaks down.
The shift of risk to the taxpayers away from the burden of responsibility should be on these corporations, smashed whatever was left of capitalist theory, which was that if you couldn't meet the market test, you went bankrupt, you went out of business. And now you actually go into Washington, if you're a big enough company, for a bailout.
That level of corruption means that, in effect, there's been a coup d'etat in the United States. We think of a coup d'etat as when the military or some political party takes over a government. We've had an overthrow in this country, but it happened from Wall Street. They didn't overthrow the system. Wall Street has simply bought it out, lock, stock, and barrel.
The problem is that in ethics, not just on Wall Street, in any business out there, whether it be in the insurance business, like you saw with AIG, or in GM, where they're, making mistakes, and then bankrupting that company, what happens is a lot of decisions that are ethical sometimes aren't great for short-term profits.
So our money went to AIG, from AIG to Goldman Sachs, and now Goldman Sachs is declaring record profits. And the CEO has the nerve to say that the reason that's happening is because he has the most productive workers in the world, and two, he's really doing God's will. He's doing good. Basically, all he did was take our money.
I feel so inadequate because I'm a late mother, and I try to work and get my home and do things in a proper order, and not be a stereotype. I worked all my life. I worked ever since I was 14. And right now with this recession, I'm not working now. And then my husband passed away. I became a widow. And all these things were totally unexpected. All these banks receiving all this money to help who? That's what I want to know. Who is it helping? Because I need help. I worked all my life. I've paid my taxes. I try to be a productive citizen. I just don't understand why we aren't getting help. I thought that this country is help for the people, and so many people. I'm not the only one that's. I've been a worker. I worked. I strived. I wanted. I was part of society, and losing my home, facing losing my home, has broken me down and totally has shattered my dreams and my hopes, and I just feel there's no mercy. What about the people and their families?
Does Congress, does the president, the head of our federal agencies who are elected or appointed to protect us, do they really care? Do they really give a damn? Well, let's take the issue of home foreclosures. This nation fell to its knees because the housing market collapsed in 2008. A guy named Barack Obama, running on hope and change, said, I'll give you hope. I'm going to change the way we do foreclosures in America. They're not going to take away your home. But what happened under Mr. Hope and Change and our Congress? There was no moratorium on foreclosures. Was there a bailout? Was there something for mortgage holders? Yeah, the banks holding the mortgages, the banks overcharging their customers. Basically, you had companies like the countrywide unit of Bank of America running nothing but a predatory loan sharking operation.
We were in a go-go time. You know, the word reality was replaced with the word realty. And as a consequence, you know, people didn't probe into this too deeply. There were voices warning of this. There were concerned people on Wall Street who questioned all this, but they were pushed aside. In fact, there was a Federal Reserve governor who challenged Alan Greenspan and said, hey, Alan, we're creating a predatory lending problem in many poorer communities. These people are being exploited. And he said, well, that's not that important because what we're seeing here is financial innovation. We're seeing, you know, whole new ways of financing things, and it's all positive because it's, you know, making the economy stronger.
So we now have a crisis of global proportions in which the failures, the debt, is literally unreckonable, and therefore you're just kind of putting money on the table and saying, well, the government will do so much with no idea whether it's really going to pay off that debt, whether it's going to allow the people who took on the debt to come up whole or not. The one thing you know is that the people at the bottom, not on Wall Street, but on Main Street, who were sold the mortgages they couldn't afford and lost the houses whose value went down and not up as they had been promised, they will not be made whole. And they are at the beginning of the food chain. They are at the bottom of the economy. They are the people who will not buy the cars, who will not go to the local stores and take advantage of the services. They are the ones who will begin this paralysis of the economy, in which the hard economy, the real economy, follows the global fiscal economy into bankruptcy.
The tragedy of America today, since Ronald Reagan, is we have systematically dismantled the democratic institutional oversight of capitalism. And now today, we have as pure a capitalistic system as we've ever had in America, and we've seen the predictable results.
In 1980, when Reagan became president and Margaret Thatcher was in England and we had Odson in Iceland and a number of other world leaders, they subscribed to Milton Friedman's idea of a new form of capitalism. He said the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits. The second tenet of predatory capitalism is that there shouldn't be any regulations. And the third tenet of this whole system is that everything should be run by private business. Privatize the schools, privatize the jails, privatize the military.
The idea of slashing government programs, getting rid of the government, turning loose the entrepreneurs, deregulating the financial sector. And it turns out Milton Friedman was wrong. We went through his experiment for the last 35 years and the system crashed.
And probably some of the most poignant and painful examples of that are the goings-on in agricultural food commodity markets and in oil markets and in basic commodity markets, which might include nowadays some exotic new things, privatization of water, privatization of sewer systems, etc. If you follow what maximizes profit, you end up feeding one man's food into another man's car.
Market fundamentalist economics would have us believe that greed is a virtue and that sharing is a sin.
After a while, the accumulation by the super rich, the accumulation of wealth becomes a pathology.
We have allowed a billionaire class to emerge. The amount of wealth that the top 400 people have is staggering.
It's a really grotesque situation where you've got a fraction of 1%. It's not the top 1%. People should stop saying that. The top 1% is 3 million people. This is more like about 50, 60,000 people.
When I was in the Chicago Boys workshop, and we'd have to change locations to avoid protesters each week. You know, we'd have some hidden place where we'd all get together. And all these guys wearing like white turtleneck sweaters with dark sunglasses. They really looked like dictators in training, as they were. To give you an idea of how these people think. And we would discuss, it wasn't theoretic stuff. We would discuss things like how to eliminate overtime for midnight shifts in Brazil's factories. The way you do it is you kill their union leaders. You arrest them and you break their knuckles. And if they don't go along with your plan, you disappear them. This is brutal stuff. This is economics at gunpoint. And I saw it there, and these people thought nothing of it. You know, to them it was just kind of shock therapy.
And after a while, the accumulation by the super rich, the accumulation of wealth becomes a pathology. They want all the wealth, all the minerals, all the riches of the world, all the manufacturing, all the financial controls, all the commodities, all of that, all the civic comforts and services of civil society while paying none of the costs or taxes or anything like that. They want it all. They say, we have a lot, we can get more, we want it all.
It's one thing to have a billionaire bailout society that runs on its own steam, but it can't. As we noticed very recently, it gambles and gambles until the bubble becomes so great that it bursts. And when it bursts, they say, look, you can't live without us. In a billionaire bailout society, you must bail us out. And we have.
You can't have rich slave owners on their latifundia and their great estates, as the Roman senators were, and all that, if you don't have slaves, people living in utter misery, creating surplus value that is then expropriated, surplus wealth that's then expropriated by the rich on top. It's called the ori sacra fames, the cursed hunger for gold.
I visited a Buddhist temple in Kyoto, and there was an inscription under the statue of one of the prophets of Buddhism there, and it said, I've only learned one thing in life, how much is enough? Not to be impoverished, but to have enough to live and to live a happy life. You don't need all of that stuff.
The ultimate reality that we have to face is that if we're going to deal with poverty, we also have to deal with gluttonous wealth. That the issue is not bringing up the bottom, the issue is redistribution. And part of that's coming to terms with the fact that we live on a finite planet.
Our community is not just the human community, it is the earth community. And our highest ethical duty is to take care of this earth community, knowing very well that without that community, we do not exist. We fade out.
In many parts of the world, the collapse has already happened. In many parts of our own country, for many families, many individuals, the collapse has already come.
If we want change, if we want real change and economic justice and fairness, we just don't want to bring the economy back to the way it was in the past with all of its corruption and all of its manipulation. We want an economy that respects the rights of people.
Force these corporations to understand that we are only going to buy from ones that no longer buy into this idea that the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs.
Participate in the Move Your Money campaigns to move our money and our financial business away from Wall Street banks.
I think it's imperative as much as possible to disengage from the current monetary paradigm.
I think we just have to change the system. We need to press the reset button. They should make that flash trading illegal. They need to reinstitute the Glass-Steagall Act.
Put back into place the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Robinson-Patman Act that were put in place to prevent them from taking over the country.
And they should impose a Tobin tax. I mean, speculation is ruining the world.
The government would supply the monopolized services that are the subject of price gouging today.
We just need to reprogram the whole thing.
Nothing will be sustainable on this planet until we have a resource-based economy. An economy based upon a relationship with the planet, with all of its animal life, treating the planet, if you will, Gaia, as a living thing.
How do we organize our local resources so that we are maximizing the meeting of our needs as human communities based on the use of our own farmlands, our own water resources, our own energy resources, predominantly solar energy resources, which of course includes hydropower, wind power, and so forth.
How do we bite off little pieces of this that
we can really succeed at and that we can point to as saying, all right, I didn't transform the world overnight, but this is what I made better for the following people.
Every community that is able to create Earth democracy and reclaim its resources, every community that's able to ban fracking, toxics, GMOs on their land, is creating a new system. Never in history has an old system collapsed and then the new one began. Within the ruins of an old system are the seeds of the new. The new is being built right now.
If we could gain control over our government in Washington, we can place in a area of supremacy the civic values, the humane values for workers in this country that have been subjected to a relentless attrition.
And we establish participatory democracy. The world now is not like Adam Smith saw it. Women are enfranchised now. Afro-Americans bear the 14th Amendment. So we can't live on Adam Smith invisible hand theory because the dynamic has changed.
Change comes from everyday people demanding different things from their government and living their lives differently. It doesn't come from a magical new leader. It doesn't come from above. All progressive change in most world history has come from the mass of people uniting and demanding a different set of things from those in charge. Abraham Lincoln didn't end slavery, although he may have been a part of the story. The struggles of millions of slaves over hundreds of years ended slavery.
So there's poverty of finances and there's poverty of spirit, and those are two very different things. Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 18 years at Robben Island and lived in a cell that was 7 foot by 8 feet wide. And he used that period of time, which could have broken some people, to turn that into a crucible of transformation that affected and catalyzed transformation in the world. So I think when we're talking about poverty, the more worrisome poverty is the poverty of spirit. It's allowing ourselves to be broken by the system. It's allowing ourselves to be paralyzed by fear, then catalyzing our resources and finding the love and the transformative power that resides in our hearts.
The fundamental question for the future is whether we are a democracy and a society in which we are dependent on one another and have responsibilities toward one another. If we are a true democracy and a true society, and we really do have responsibilities to one another, then the plight of the poor, the plight of somebody who's lost a job, lost health insurance, the plight of the single mother, the plight of all of the people who are finding themselves without resources through no fault of their own, is something that we all need to be deeply concerned about and act upon.
The most important point is the young people. Even from wealthy families, when they are exposed to the reality of how nature works, by working according to the laws of nature, then creating a war against nature with lethal war chemicals, with fossil fuels, with a mind that does not understand the sophistication of the web of life, the children of these wealthy people are waking up. And my very deep hope is that the instability that they are creating will be stopped by their own children who remind them what human life is about.